Remembering 9/11, the nation honors those who died and salutes all who serve on the 14th anniversary of the attacks. Stewards of the earth, Pope Francis warns of the dangers of climate change and challenges the world to take action. Refugee crisis, tens of thousands face a dangerous journey as they flee war-torn Syria. Preparing for the Pope, a group of nuns are working round the clock, prepping for Philly's papal mass. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Friday, September 11th, 2015. Good evening and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Wyatt Goolsby with your News Now. Americans are marking the 14th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks today. From New York and Washington to Pennsylvania and even Afghanistan, Americans everywhere are finding a way to pause and reflect. On this somber morning at Ground Zero, Americans began the day honoring the victims of those who died 14 years ago. Family members held a moment of silence and read each of their relatives' names.
Brian Eugene Bilcher.
Some carried photos of their loved ones as they remembered the day when hijackers drove two planes into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
We cannot understand how it has felt on every day since, to long for their laugh, to see their smile, or to feel their embrace. We simply cannot comprehend the weight of their absence.
Defense Secretary Ash Carter offering his condolences during a ceremony outside the Pentagon. He went on to say they honor the victims by serving their country. The American flag flew at half-staff over the White House on Friday as President Obama and the First Lady held a moment of silence on the South Lawn. The president went on to tweet, 14 years after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, we honor those we lost. We salute all who serve and keep us safe. We stand as strong as ever. Allied military forces based in Afghanistan on Friday marked the anniversary with a short ceremony in the capital, Kabul. For many Americans, the memory of the 2001 attacks is still fresh in their minds, a reminder for many to remain vigilant 14 years later. Now to some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. A pro-life victory across the pond. Lawmakers in England and Wales rejected a law to allow some terminally ill adults to end their life today. 118 members of Parliament were in favor of the law and 330 against it. The BBC reports it's the first vote on the issue in almost 20 years, and the debate was passionate on both sides. Pope Francis urges world leaders to listen to the poor when deciding how to fight climate change. The Holy Father told a group promoting sustainable development the poor suffer the most from the consequences of climate change. Pope Francis is expected to urge similar action in his speeches to Congress and the United Nations later this month. Members of the group meeting at the Vatican presented the Pope with an electric bicycle. In India, 12 suspected Islamic militants are convicted for bombing 7 Mumbai commuter trains that killed 188 people and wounded more than 800. The bombing happened 9 years ago. The trial in India's notoriously slow justice system lasted more than 7 years. One defendant was acquitted for lack of evidence. The judge says he'll announce the sentence Monday after hearing arguments from the prosecutors and defense attorneys. The 12 face the death penalty or life in prison. A court in Venezuela has sentenced a political opposition leader to almost 14 years in prison. Leopoldo Lopez was convicted of inciting violent protests in which dozens of people died last year. Human Rights Watch says Lopez's trial was a sham and called his conviction baseless. Lopez is a long-standing opponent of President Nicolas Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. Chavez's government banned Lopez from running for office in 2008. Cuba says it is releasing more than 3,500 prisoners ahead of the Holy Father's visit to the island next week. It's the third time Cuba has granted inmates freedom before a papal visit. The government will not release people convicted of serious crimes like murder, child sex abuse, or violations of state security. That includes political prisoners. The Republican-led House goes on record against the Iran nuclear deal. After 3 hours of the debate, the House voted 269 to 162 to reject the deal, but the symbolic vote will not have any impact. Senate Democrats voted on Thursday to uphold the accord with Iran. That action guarantees that any bill disapproving the pact will never reach Obama's desk. Vice President Joe Biden says he's not emotionally ready to run for president. His comments came during an interview on Stephen Colbert's The Late Show. Biden says he's overwhelmed at times by his son's death and could not be sure he's committed to being president. Biden's son, Beau, died earlier this year from brain cancer. This is the strongest indicator the vice president may be leaning against running for the Democratic nomination. Baltimore's mayor will not seek re-election next year, nearly 5 months after the city erupted into violent riots. Stephanie Rawlings Blake says she believes she would win re-election, but seeking office is not the best decision. This comes days after officials say Baltimore will pay Freddie Gray's family $6.4 million in settlement claims. Gray died of a spinal injury while in police custody, igniting violent protests in the city. Catholic, Evangelical, and Methodist leaders stand together today calling for reform of the criminal justice system. As Jason Calvi tells us, they say they're walking with Pope Francis tonight. Jason?
Wyatt, they made their pitch right here where Pope Francis will be in just 13 days. It's part of the Archdiocese of Washington's Walk with Francis pledge, where people commit to pray, serve, or act. Those pledges will be given to the Pope as a gift.
After his historic speech to Congress, the Holy Father will have an unscripted encounter with clients of Catholic Charities. Former inmate Rudy Washington will be there at St. Patrick's Church.
Man, I'm like, wow, man, I'm blown away and honored. I'm honored for him to come to my town to be able to meet with him in his presence.
The Holy Father will then walk in through these doors into the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Washington's headquarters. Then he'll bless this chapel. And Pope Francis will walk out these doors, gathering with the homeless, coming here for a meal.
It's right here today that Rudy, D.C.'s Cardinal Wuerl, and other activists say they're inspired by Pope Francis in their call for reform of the justice system.
As Catholics, it's really important for us because of Matthew 25, that everything we do for those who are in prison is actually doing it for Christ himself.
They're calling for fairer sentences and rehabilitation to keep people from going back to jail.
We need a system that is constructive, that moves a person away from a life, a behavior that is criminal.
Rudy Washington is one of 1,100 taking part in Catholic Charities' Welcome Home program for former convicts. He says he wants to mentor others like him and share his story with the Pope.
I'm so honored.
The U.S. Bishops' Conference tells us the Senate is close to bringing forward a bipartisan bill on criminal justice reform. The Pope himself will visit prisoners in Philadelphia. And you may remember, Wyatt, that on his first Holy Thursday as pontiff, Pope Francis washed the feet of prisoners.
Jason Calvi reporting from Catholic Charities of Washington, D.C. Jason, thanks very much. And we're happy to have back in the studio John Carr. He's the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. So John, less than 2 weeks, the Pope arrives in the U.S. What can you point out about the Holy Father that will help us to understand his message?
Well, in some ways, Pope Francis is the ultimate Washington outsider. I don't think there's any other world leader of his stature or coming to our country who have never set foot here. We'll be seeing him in our country. He'll be meeting us up close for the first time. So I think it'll be fascinating. The other first is he will be the first Pope to talk to a joint meeting of Congress. You're too young, but I remember when 55 years ago, major American figures said that John Kennedy should not be elected president because he would take advice from the Pope. And now it seems like the only thing Democrats and Republicans agree on is they need advice from the Pope.
We definitely come a little bit way since then. What themes do you think Pope Francis will touch on when he's here?
Pope Francis looks at the world, he looks at the economy, he looks at the environment, he looks at our church from the bottom up, from the outside in. So he will be talking about the least of these, he'll be talking about the unborn, he'll be talking about immigrants, he'll be talking about how we protect the family and how we protect immigrants in our society. He has this wonderful metaphor of a terrible metaphor, actually, of a throwaway society. And you think of the little boy in the Planned Parenthood video being thrown away. You think of the little boy on the beach we've seen on our televisions being thrown away.
Yeah.
He's going to remind us that every life is sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly he's going to be touching on that more in Philadelphia as well. Do you think that, you mentioned that he's, the ultimate Washington outsider. Do you think while he's in D.C., politicians will essentially be jockeying to sort of align themselves with Pope Francis due to his high popularity?
Well, anyone who tries to politicize the visit, I think, will regret it. Pope Francis is coming with a moral framework, a set of principles, not a legislative agenda or a five-point program. His approval ratings, our politicians would die for.
Right.
And my advice is don't try to use the Pope. Try and follow him. When he moves from Capitol Hill to Catholic Charities, the place we just saw, he will be making a statement on not only his trip, but on the priorities of our nation. So my advice is don't try and co-opt or substitute for the Pope. Amplify his message and follow his advice.
It's a really good message, and obviously things to keep in mind as Pope Francis making his visit as a pastor, and in that light. John Carr, we thank you so much for being with us, the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
With a much anticipated visit from Pope Francis comes a lot of preparation, even in the smallest details. A group of immigrant mothers are embroidering the linens that will be used at the altar for the Pope's Mass in Madison Square Garden. 18 women, most of them Mexican, were chosen by a charity of the Archdiocese of New York. They say their craft is inspired by their Catholic faith and admiration for Pope Francis. The volunteers have been working long days on this project since late July. Coming up, Pope Francis welcomes the leader of a country at the center of the migration crisis in Europe, and we discuss how the U.S. can protect Christians facing persecution in the Middle East. Even if the forces of darkness appear to prevail, those who believe in God know that evil and death do not have the final say. A quote from St. John Paul II one day after the 9/11 attacks. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Pope Francis receives the president of Serbia at the Vatican to discuss the migration crisis in Europe. The two leaders discuss ways of working together to promote a solution for Syrian and Iraqi refugees fleeing war and conflict in their home countries. According to the Vatican, they also talked about Serbia's progress towards full integration into the European Union. Meanwhile, migrants and refugees continue to pour into Hungary. Many have been spotted walking along railway tracks. In some cases, families are traveling with small children. They have to share food and look after their youngest. Many of them have a long road ahead as they are trying to reach countries in Central or Western Europe. In Austria, several hundred people walked to a local train station to catch a train to Germany, but trains were only due to arrive hours later. The Austrian Railway says it no longer has the capacity to deal with the thousands of people at Nikolsdorf crossing wanting to board trains daily to the Austrian capital. There is a sense of growing desperation inside Lebanon's refugee camps. Several aid groups providing shelter to Syrians are slashing food and cash support. Many of those Syrians now thinking of taking the risk to leave and head towards Europe. But that has proven to be a dangerous journey that's already killed thousands. One Syrian father of 4 says he's willing to get out of Lebanon by any means possible.
I'm thinking of traveling outside of Lebanon, anywhere I can reach by air, by sea, to Turkey, or to any country. I'm going to take the risk. But right now, I do not have money.
The UN Refugee Agency in Jordan says their funding has a 50% shortfall in light of Syria's crisis this year. Haram Hamparan is the executive director of the Armenian National Committee of America. Haram, you are asking the U.S. government to protect Christians in the Middle East. What are some of the ways the U.S. can do that?
We'd like to see the United States step up the military intervention against ISIS forces that are targeting Christians and other civilian populations. We'd like to see our government push back against Turkey, which we feel has used the cover of a war against ISIS to actually attack the Kurds and other minority populations. And finally, we think we can do better on the delivery of aid. There are gaps in the delivery of aid that have left very at-risk populations vulnerable, and many of those populations are Christians.
Like I say, you've been talking about this issue for a while. Are you getting any support from Congress?
We sure are. Congressman Fortenberry and Congresswoman Eshoo just introduced legislation that would define what is happening against the Christians in the Middle East as a genocide, which it is. It's an intentional effort, systematic effort to destroy people based on their faith, and that's genocide. So that legislation was just introduced this week. We're eager to see that move forward.
Tell me more specifically about the Armenian community in the Middle East and their plight.
The Armenians have lived throughout the Middle East for centuries. The Armenian presence in our homeland goes back about 4,000 years, but we also have Armenian populations in Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, and throughout the region. We've come under attack along with many other Christians in recent years. ISIS and other forces of intolerance have targeted Armenians. We're doing what we can in solidarity with other Christian groups to see if we can sort of rally the world to the defense of the Christian presence in the Middle East.
And it's why you're here in town this week. You're here for the In Defense of Christians Summit. Can you give us a snapshot of what you've seen and heard this week?
We've seen tremendous solidarity among the Christian community for the plight of our countrymen back in the homeland, back in the old country. We know that Pope Francis has spoken very, very powerfully about the Armenian genocide, and he has defined what's happening there today as genocide. We see support from the Evangelical community, from the Orthodox community, the Catholic community. There's been, what I've noticed is strong solidarity, growing awareness among American politicians. The challenge we face is that so often these things are dealt with at the level of politics. The genocide is a moral issue. We need to elevate the discourse to the moral imperative that this is.
Why do you think it's so important that Christians stay in the Middle East as opposed to just simply fleeing?
Because we're part of the rich tapestry of that part of the world. For so much of the history of that part of the world, the various peoples of the region have worked closely together. We've had differences, but we've been able to kind of to build on those differences and to make a richer society for it. I think that a Middle East without Christians would be a less safe place, a less diverse place, and I think ultimately a more dangerous place.
I'm sure it's something that we wouldn't want to imagine, so obviously it's an important cause that you continue to advocate for. Aram Hamparan, the Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Up next, we go to Philadelphia, where a group of cloistered nuns are working to supply tens of thousands of hosts for the papal mass. And visitors to the Vatican now have a new way to travel to the Pope's summer home. Having faith does not mean having no difficulties, but having the strength to face them, knowing we are not alone. A tweet from Pope Francis earlier this year that got more than 23,000 retweets. Michael O'Loughlin is a national reporter for Crux and the author of a new book, The Tweetable Pope, A Spiritual Revolution in 140 Characters. Michael, Pope Benedict was technically the first pope on Twitter, but how have we seen Pope Francis sort of embrace social media?
Yeah, that's right. Pope Benedict made history by being the first pope to join, which was really remarkable to see this kind of aged German pontiff join Twitter.
I remember him on that iPad.
Yeah, it was a really cool experience. And he collected about 3 million followers before he resigned. And then when Francis took office, he assumed the papal Twitter account. And it's jumped up to more than 23 million followers. And I think the success comes because Francis loves being with people, and a lot of us are on social media today. So it's a way for Francis to kind of cut through all the noise and all the spin and connect directly with his flock, and people have responded very enthusiastically.
As you know, a tweet is so short and simple. Is that sort of in line with Pope Francis' style, do you think?
I think the thing about Twitter is it takes a lot of effort and skill to distill a message down to its core components and to create something people will remember and respond to. And Francis is so good at that. He speaks in sound bites that are memorable and kind of exciting, and they translate really well to Twitter.
Well, like I say, you've been following his tweets a long time now. Is there a reoccurring theme in his tweeting?
Yeah, like in the book I have 17 chapters with all different themes. Of course, he tweets about prayer and Jesus and God quite a bit. And he also tweets about community. You know, he talks about our church and we the people. And you see a real theme of kind of community in there that's very important to him, and this pushing back this idea that we can do this on our own. Those are, I think, are themes that stick out.
What do you think it's going to be like, or how the media is going to receive Pope Francis when he lands in D.C. in 11 short days?
Yeah, it's going to be wild. I know at Crux we're ready for this kind of onslaught of media attention that Pope Francis is going to get, and I think it's going to be an exciting, successful trip. There's some challenges with making sure crowds get to see Pope Francis, but the media loves this guy, I think, and there'll be a lot of coverage of his speech to Congress, and I think there'll be some critical reaction too, which there should be to any public figure. So it's going to be an exciting time for the Church in the United States, and Pope Francis will rise to the occasion.
Do you think with all of this that he's doing, embracing social media, do you think he's really being able to speak to a younger demographic?
Yeah, I mean, we see young people clamoring for selfies with the Pope, for example. I think people might not be hearing the messages in church. We know young people don't go to Mass as often as maybe church leaders would like them to, but they feel connected with Pope Francis. He's a pastor, and I think social media is one way to really connect with this Pope.
I'm sure Catholics would agree. You know, that's an important first step, just being able to make that connection and hopefully bring people back to the church in that way.
Yeah, I think Pope Francis wants to, really engage with young people.
Okay, well, obviously you're going to be watching. We're going to be watching at EWTN. We'll see if he crashes Twitter servers or what ends up happening. Michael O'Loughlin with the Tweetable Pope is the book. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Before Pope Francis lands in the U.S., a lot of preparation is underway. A group of nuns is working overtime ahead of the trip. Catherine Zeltner is here with more. Catherine?
Why the Poor Clares support themselves by making altar breads. The nuns are working double time to help with Pope Francis's Mass on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, where 2 million people are expected to attend. Nestled in quiet Langhorne, Pennsylvania, the Poor Clare sisters are busy at work. Their monastery is one of a few that bake altar breads, later consecrated into communion hosts. Now they have an order of papal proportions to fill.
We're just grateful to be able to participate in this way with the Pope's Mass.
Working extra shifts for 2 months, the Poor Clares recently finished baking 100,000 altar breads for Pope Francis's outdoor Mass in Philadelphia. The sisters have it down to a science.
First we mix the batter, then it's baked. It comes off, we cut the bread in half so that it fits into the humidity cabinet. Then after the bread is damp enough, it's cut on our machines, 35 hosts at a time. So then we bag them into 250 size bags and seal them.
The Poor Clare nuns work around the clock, never forgetting the importance of their labor.
It's making the breads that will become the body of Christ once they're consecrated by the priest.
The sisters typically only leave their monastery for medical reasons, but 8 of the Poor Clare nuns have special permission to attend Philadelphia's papal Mass. Wyatt?
Catherine Zeltner, thanks very much for that great report. Finally tonight, train service between the Vatican's tiny station and the papal summer residence will debut tomorrow. Today, the Vatican showed off the century-old train to the media. In the past, Vatican trains have only carried popes around Italy or special events such as bringing sick children to the Vatican to visit the Pope. Passengers say it's quite an experience.
It reminds me of this. It reminds me of something from the 19th century. I feel like I've gone back in time really from it. And just compared to the state of the trains nowadays, I just think it's absolutely gorgeous. And to have an experience like this, to be on this train.
Day-long visits to the palace at Castel Gandolfo and its gardens, including the farm that feeds the Pope, are now on offer through the Vatican museums. And we thank you for joining us tonight. Be sure to watch the next couple of weeks as we are gearing up for the Pope's trip to Cuba and the United States. And you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Good night and God bless.